September 11th, 2023, 4 in the morning, the city of Derna was still sleeping beneath the downpour of Storm Daniel. 2 hours later, that city no longer existed. In less than 120 minutes, 2 upstream dams failed simultaneously, and a wall of water taller than a 7-story building collapsed into the valley where more than 100,000 people lay sleeping. This is the deadliest flood disaster in Africa in more than 50 years, and its cause was far more than heavy rainfall alone, because those dams on the hillside had been warned to fail before the storm had even approached Libya. The story of Derna begins with its unusual geography, with unmaintained dams and with a storm that exceeded every forecast. Derna sits on the northeastern Libyan coast, wedged between desert cliffs and the Mediterranean Sea. The Wadi Derna River was the city's only lifeline, flowing from the plateau down to the sea through a valley as narrow as a giant fissure. Upstream, 13 kilometers from the city, the Abu Mansour Dam was built in 1973, storing water for a desert city. Below it, the second Bilad Dam, built in 1977, served as a second layer of protection for the city downstream. But neither structure had undergone a single engineering inspection since 2002. Derna was a city of white lanes, lime-washed walls, rusted iron balconies, and fig trees growing from cracked sidewalks, typical 20th century North African Arab architecture. On the afternoon before the storm made landfall, fishermen were still pulling their boats up the dark sand shore of the Mediterranean as they did every day. Storm Daniel formed in the Mediterranean and had already caused severe flooding in Greece, Bulgaria, and Turkey before moving toward the Libyan coast. On the 10th of September, the storm carried rainfall equivalent to Libya's entire average annual precipitation and dumped it in less than 24 hours. The topographic bowl of Jabal al-Aqda acted like an enormous funnel, channeling all the rainwater directly into Wadi Derna. On the night of the 11th of September, water levels behind the Abu Mansour Dam began rising at a rate that appeared in none of its original design scenarios. And then, at 2:20 in the morning, the pressure finally became too great. The Abu Mansour Dam breached at 2:20 in the morning on the 11th of September. 30 million cubic meters of water, equivalent to 12,000 Olympic swimming pools, escaped the reservoir within minutes. That water wave reached the downstream Bilad Dam within minutes and destroyed it instantly in an immediate domino effect. Peak. Try to picture this differently. The entire water volume of Westlake in Hanoi multiplied 30 times over, pouring through a valley narrower than 2 football fields in less than 1 hour. The speed of the water wall as it reached the city exceeded 70 kilometers per hour, roughly 45 miles per hour, the speed of a car on a city freeway. At 2:45 in the morning, the first flood wave reached Derna's most densely populated district, where 7-story concrete apartment blocks crowded both banks of the river. Those buildings were not engineered to withstand the hydraulic pressure of a 20-meter water column. Within 15 minutes, the entire riverside district of Derna, home to nearly 25,000 people, was completely erased. Think about what happens when not just your home, but the only hospital, every government building, and the sole evacuation corridor of the entire city all sit inside that same valley. Al-Wada, Derna's largest hospital, was flooded to its 3rd floor within less than 10 minutes of the first wave striking its walls. Peak. This was not simply a flooded city. This was the moment every rescue system in an entire city was destroyed at the precise moment it was needed most. Sidi Faraj Bridge, the main traffic artery connecting both halves of the city, was completely swept away within 30 minutes of the flood beginning. With no bridge, no hospital, and no intact escape route, the city became a completely isolated island in total darkness. The narrow valley topography meant the water did not simply spread sideways, but was compressed and accelerated longitudinally, like water through a high-pressure nozzle. That velocity was sufficient to carry a 30-ton concrete truck the way a current carries an aluminum can. The layer of mud and debris left on Derna's streets by the flood was 2 to 4 meters deep, equivalent to a single-story house being completely buried. The flood not only destroyed what stood above ground, it scoured the foundations of hundreds of buildings, leaving them liable to collapse at any moment for weeks afterward. Imagine a city of 120,000 people, where at least 1/4 of all standing structures were upright, but no one knew which one would collapse next. Geoscience explains this through the concept of instantaneous hydraulic loading, meaning when water pressure acts too rapidly, concrete structures cannot respond in time and fracture brittly rather than deforming gradually. Peak. This was the most catastrophic flood disaster in Africa since the northern Angola floods of 1971, and it unfolded in a time span shorter than an ordinary feature film. When dawn broke at around 5:30 in the morning, survivors on rooftops and upper floors looked down at a landscape they could no longer recognize as their own city. In that isolated city with no electricity and no communications, those who had the strength began digging with hand tools through 2 meters of mud. The coastal highway connecting Derna to Benghazi, about 170 miles to the west, was blocked by landslides at least 8 separate points. That isolation meant the first professional rescue teams from Benghazi could not arrive within the critical first 24 hours, when every hour could mean the difference between life and death for those trapped. The first rescue calls to international organizations began near 6 in the morning, but Derna had no nearby airport capable of receiving heavy rescue aircraft. Libya in 2023 remained politically fractured after more than 12 years of civil conflict, with 2 parallel governments and no unified national disaster response agency. That meant the first foreign aid from Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar had to coordinate simultaneously with 2 different governments, losing hours while the search countdown was still running. Meanwhile, in Derna, residents organized themselves into improvised search groups using whatever they had: shovels, bare hands, and nearly drained phone batteries. 48 hours after the disaster, the official missing persons count had exceeded 10,000, with more than 4,000 confirmed deaths. Those numbers did not hold still because thousands had been swept directly into the sea, and their remains were drifting along the Libyan coast and even toward the Greek shores hundreds of kilometers away. The destruction was concentrated in a 3-square-kilometer zone in the city center, equivalent to the entire Hoan Kiem district of Hanoi being wiped clean, not a single building left standing. Per square kilometer, the destruction density in Derna exceeded even bombed areas of World War II Europe, according to subsequent UNOSAT satellite analysts. The first international rescue teams to arrive described scenes as belonging to another world: no road recognizable, no building retaining its original form. Acoustic detection equipment was deployed in desperation, listening for faint tapping sounds beneath the concrete. In a city with no electricity and no stable communications signal, rescue coordination in the early days relied almost entirely on word of mouth and handwritten notes. Meanwhile, survivors began leaving the city westward, along remaining roads, carrying whatever they had managed to save. 1 week after the disaster, mechanical excavators finally reached Derna and began cutting through the reinforced concrete layers that human hands alone could not. At the deepest point in the destruction zone, the mud and debris layer was so thick that ground-penetrating equipment could not identify the original ground surface. The European Space Agency compared before and after satellite images and confirmed that at least 25% of Derna's built area had vanished entirely, not collapsed, but swept into the sea. Out at sea, in front of the city, a debris and mud spit more than 300 meters long had formed from the remains of swept-away buildings. Libya had lost not just a city, but a piece of irreplaceable history, because Derna was one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in North Africa, with more than 2,000 years of cultural continuity. As rescue teams began cutting through the mud layers, they found Roman pottery, Ottoman coins, and unexcavated archaeological sites, churned together with concrete and scrap steel. 3 weeks after the disaster, the official death toll stood at 4,600, but international organizations, including the Libyan Red Crescent, estimated the real figure could be double, as many remains were still buried under mud or had been swept out to sea. 10,000 missing was the figure used by United Nations OCHA for many weeks, a number that could not be reconciled because no intact population records survived. Around 80,000 people were displaced, a number equivalent to the entire population of a provincial capital like Harjiang City being forced to leave overnight. Direct economic damage was estimated by the World Bank at around $1.8 billion. But that figure did not account for the cost of rebuilding a city that essentially had to be constructed from scratch. Wadi Derna itself, the watercourse that had sustained the city for 3,000 years, had been deeply incised by the flood force, scoured 4 meters deeper through the urban reach. The coastline in front of Derna was completely altered geomorphically, with a new 300-meter-wide underwater shoal of mud and debris shallowing the nearshore zone. Seawater analysis in the 3 weeks after the disaster showed bacterial and chemical contamination from broken sewer systems extending more than 20 kilometers along the coast, posing severe epidemic risk. The World Health Organization and UNICEF issued urgent warnings about the risk of cholera and typhoid outbreaks due to severely contaminated groundwater, and beneath all that measurable loss lay an immeasurable one: the entire collective memory of a city, family photographs, legal documents, ancestral graves, all buried under 3 meters of mud. Derna forced a larger question that was not Libya's alone to answer, namely, who bears responsibility when infrastructure protecting hundreds of thousands of people has been dangerously neglected for decades? Because engineers from Omar al-Mukhtar University had warned of the dangerous condition of Abu Mansour Dam in a technical report dating from 2022, more than a year before it failed. That report was not acted upon, no repair budget was allocated, and no evacuation order was issued before Storm Daniel, despite the storm being clearly forecast. The final figures from the Derna crisis: 4,600 confirmed dead, more than 11,000 missing, 80,000 homeless. Those numbers do not stand alone, but stand beside the question of whether they needed to happen at all. After the Derna disaster, engineers and hydrological scientists worldwide immediately turned to examining dams, sharing the same profile: aging, uninspected, and positioned above densely populated cities. According to the World Register of Dams maintained by the International Commission on Large Dams, more than 1/3 of the world's 58,000 large dams have exceeded their designed operational lifespan. That does not mean all those dams will fail, but it does mean millions of people currently live downstream from structures never reassessed against modern design standards or climate change projections. Storm Daniel itself was the product of a warmer-than-normal Mediterranean, with sea surface temperatures 2 to 3 degrees Celsius higher than the historical September average that year. Higher sea temperatures mean more energy pumped into the storm, more water vapor, and more intense rainfall, a mechanism climate scientists had been forecasting for decades. Post-disaster attribution science, published after the event, confirmed that climate change had made Storm Daniel's rainfall at least 50% more intense than it would have been in a pre-climate change world. Derna is not the only city standing beneath an uninspected dam, beneath an increasingly intense storm track, and beneath a government without adequate disaster response capacity. Cities such as Marrakech in Morocco, Gaziantep in Turkey, and river towns of central Algeria all fall within similar potential risk zones according to post-disaster dam risk assessments. But Derna also changed something. It forced the United Nations and World Bank to establish an emergency dam inspection program for low- and middle-income countries for the first time in history. New early warning systems based on satellite monitoring and real-time water level sensors are being piloted in 14 countries across North Africa and the Middle East, following the Libya experience. If early warning systems and evacuation orders had been activated just 2 hours before the dam broke, hydrological models show the death toll could have been reduced to below 200. 2 hours, the length of a feature film, was the margin between the most catastrophic disaster Africa had seen in half a century and an entirely manageable outcome. That was something science, engineering, and early warning had placed entirely within human reach. But a chain of undone decisions, unread reports, and unallocated budgets closed that margin to zero. September 11th, 2023, 4 in the morning, Derna was sleeping. At 4 in the morning, hundreds of thousands of people did not know that 2 hours later, their lives would be divided into before and after. The Abu Mansour Dam had stood there for 50 years. It only needed to be inspected. And today, that question no longer belongs to Libya alone. It belongs to every city living downstream from last century's infrastructure that no one has yet dared to look at directly. In the first hours when no accurate information was available from inside the city, crisis managers in Tripoli and Benghazi had to make decisions based on fragmentary messages from the few mobile phones that still had battery. A local journalist, in darkness with a nearly drained phone, recorded the first footage from his rooftop showing the entire central city district had vanished beneath mud. Those videos, uploaded to social media at nearly 6 in the morning, were how the world first saw the true scale of what had happened to Derna. But when the world was watching, it was 6 in the morning, and the 4 hours after that represented the final golden window for finding survivors beneath the rubble, which no one in Derna had the specialist equipment to pursue. When international experts finally completed a technical assessment of both dams, they found that both had detectable structural cracks for at least 2 years before failing. The estimated repair cost for both dams was between $1 and $2 million, less than 1/1000th of the damage their failure caused. In the months after the disaster, Libya faced debate over whether to rebuild Derna in place or relocate the entire city away from the flood valley. That question remained unresolved as of early 2025, with displaced families still living in temporary accommodation and waiting for an answer. Derna now stands on the list of disasters the world studies to understand what happens when multiple systems fail simultaneously: engineering, governance, and climate. Not one single system failure was unavoidable. The dam failed because it was not inspected. There was no warning because there was no system. There was no evacuation because there was no plan. 4 in the morning, September 11th, 2023, Derna was sleeping, and tens of thousands of people there did not know they were living through the final moments of a city standing atop something that could have been prevented. Blocked roads did not only isolate Derna from rescue, they isolated witnesses, meaning weeks passed before the world began to fully understand what had happened that night. Rescue teams from Egypt and Qatar brought advanced technical equipment to Benghazi within 24 hours, but needed 12 more hours to open a route to Derna. A total of 36 hours passed from the dam break to the arrival of the first professional rescue team in central Derna, a period rescue science classifies as exceeding the practical survival threshold for those trapped without water. The Libyan Red Crescent, working with the ICRC and international partners, established the largest missing persons database ever built in North Africa, with more than 11,000 case files opened. In the early weeks, most families arriving at missing persons registration centers left with the same answer: no information yet. More than 1 year after the disaster, at least 3,000 people remained unaccounted for and were believed to lie beneath the sea or under deep mud in areas not yet fully excavated. The walls of water that poured through the canyon eroded not just the ground, but the ability to fully count what was lost. September 2023 was not only the month Derna was destroyed, it was the month the world was forced to face a question long deferred. How many dams around the world are standing in the position Abu Mansur was. The answer from the International Energy Agency and the International Commission on Large Dams following the Derna event was that no one knew precisely, and that was the problem. Since September 2023, 17 countries have launched national dam inspection programs for the first time in decades, a small shift on the global map, but potentially the difference between the next event and no event. At 2:20 in the morning on September 11th, 2023, the Abu Mansur Dam broke open. The consequences of 2 minutes of collapse and 2 hours of water are still shaping the lives of tens of thousands of people at this very moment. And the question of who bears responsibility for that still has no complete answer.